Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Making Action Happen, the show we do every Thursday for our members, our Action 22 members, for Coloradans, and now for people around the world. I'm Sarah Blackhurst.
And I'm Brian McCain.
Welcome back. So today's show is fun for us because we're celebrating the end of the legislative session. And for all of you policy nerds out there who listen to our show regularly, of course, we had to have the incomparable Mike Beasley back. He has been bare knuckling it up there at the Capitol this entire session, and he deserves a hero's welcome home for going through all that. Mike, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, so we've talked about the session. You came on in the middle of it and before. And then I always like to ask you this question every year. Is this session different or is it the same? What's going on? And so I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask you. So how does this session compare to other sessions in your career?
This has been the toughest time in the 30 years I've been around this process, not just because of the sheer volume and the weight of the work that we've done, but how difficult it was to communicate with legislators and then back to us in the executive branch during COVID. It's very difficult, to lobby without paper and, being able to get into a room and meet with the legislator. I don't know about you or your listeners and viewers, but I just am sick of Zooms. It's hard to read somebody's body language, their face, et cetera, when we're working so differently. The 2020 session, when you think about it, let me go back. When you think about it, we've had at least 6 sessions since January of 2019, because in 2020 and in this year, we stopped and we started, we stopped and we started. And that meant that we never stopped working. We were always trying to stay ahead of the policies and really kind of help facilitate meaningful dialogue around these big issues. And it was just really, really hard. And having said that, I'm glad that it's over. And I think it's fair to say that from a state policy perspective, this was a transformational session. It really was.
So along that vein, talk a little bit about, or give us some examples of what you mean by a transformational session.
Well, the legislature passed Senate Bill 260, which is a bill that put $5.4 billion over the next several years into transportation, with some modest gas tax adjustment, but with big fee increases on things like when folks use Uber or they have food delivered to their house, prioritization of some general fund money, state general fund money into roads. And, when you look at that bill on the whole, I think it was testified that at least 25 to 30% of those dollars is going into not necessarily that traditional road, filling potholes and building bridges, but into the beginnings of a massive investment in infrastructure for electric vehicles, that type of thing. So that's a huge shift. Really one of the first states in the country to make that kind of policy decision. And so we'll have to see how it turns out. Go ahead.
The buzzword for all of that was multimodal. Every time, and I have to give props to these guys because they really did a very thorough job on the stakeholder side of it. It was really great, but I was sick to death of hearing multimodal, and I literally called you one day and said, please explain to me what this actually is.
Well, multimodal is a vision that, you can't fix our transportation problems by just building the roads. You need to get people off the roads into public transportation like light rail or buses, encourage different types of growth and development patterns that rely on folks taking bikes or building communities that where you can walk to work, walk stores, restaurants, et cetera. And I think that works well in high density areas. I think it remains to be seen in my mind how that will work in a state that is mostly, large rural geographic areas, where density of that type doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. It's almost laughable when you do a compare and contrast that with that in mind. Um, and ultimately, it passed. When will we start to feel the effects of it, of the transportation bill?
That's a good question. You'll start to see, the governor's administration has put a lot of thought into this, as Department of Transportation. You're going to start to see more orange cones and more conversations in communities about these multimodal solutions, I think within weeks. That's how fast that it'll move. And that folks will start to see it on their Uber app and that type of thing. And again, I think it's going to be important for folks in rural Colorado to make sure that their voice is heard as this is developed and people think about it. It's always important, and I mean it in a respectful way, but you always have to remind folks that at any level of government that life exists outside of Denver. And I can't underscore that enough. And so seeing how it's implemented, how Main Street revitalization, what it looks like, how it takes effect, it's going to be really important for organizations like Action 22 and your listeners and viewers to make sure they're active participants.
Yeah, and that's, you brought it up. That's why Action 22, Club 20, Pro 15 are important, because life does exist outside of Denver, and we can be the voice for that. And we have to encourage our membership, and they have to stay vocal in this. This isn't we pass it and it's done. You still have to be involved with this going forward, correct?
Absolutely. And now more than ever, right? The ink's going to dry on these types of bills, and we'll talk about some more in a bit. But this is a major change in the law and in policy. And so, the governor and others have reached out. They want to know what you all think, and it's important to make sure that you deliver that message and help them achieve that vision.
And to be fair, too, during this whole process, the governor's office, the legislators, they opened that stakeholder process, and they called us weekly asking, how does your membership feel about this? Is this the right thing to do for rural Colorado or the Action 22 area? And
Well, would make a difference, yeah.
And that's why we came out in support of it.
Yeah, that was the primary reason.
Yeah.
Well, and they actually made changes to some of the drafts based on those conversations. And that was, even though we didn't 100% love it, and we had a few people that weren't happy with us, that we did support it. I think we have to continue to support or encourage that stakeholder involvement, because we saw a lot of bills this year that did not have that. So let's talk losses, and then we can talk wins.
Well, let me conclude the transportation part by saying the hard part wasn't passing the bill, it's going to be implementing it. And so really have an obligation to kind of jump in and have a say in that. The governor again talked about it in a State of the State about, this being a transformational session for Colorado, and it really was. They had a $34 billion budget that ended up having about $4 billion more state dollars to spend than they thought that they would. And they were able to do things like education. So education was a big winner, K through 12. They were able to store many of the cuts that they made over the last year and a half, and then get more money into the classroom per kid across the state. Historic a Supreme Court decision on how the state and local governments will work together on how they assess the property tax and the mill levies related to schools. They were able to put a record amount of money into affordable housing, $800 million of state money. That doesn't include the $2+ billion they used to federal money for COVID response and stimulation of the economy. For example, workforce retraining to supporting our cultural facilities, right? Kind of really working on a Colorado stimulus plan that had both not only federal funds but state funds as well. You know, lots of winners there, right? I mean, trying to climb out of this hole and to get people to work and then to continue to grow the economy is big. But I think what you're going to see over the next year, if I were to forecast something for everyone that's watching and listening, is what inflation is going to do, because inflation is going to eat up a lot of these gains in the budget. We not only have growth, but now we'll have inflation. Growth in population, but this inflationary piece. So if you've gone to get gas lately or went to go buy milk or what have you, you can see that's going to affect the cost of healthcare for people in our jails, for our senior citizens, how we fund the School Finance Act, how higher ed wants to come and say, well, I need to raise tuition a little bit more than what we had thought because of inflation. So that is the downside of what I see coming, but I mostly see, positive there. The legislature took on tax policy reform. So they did do about $375 million worth of tax cuts. I think members of the legislature who voted for this would call it tax policy reform. But they really did, in some business deductions, raise taxes on certain how individuals report their earnings, and then redistributed those revenues to, earned income tax credit and those types of things to help folks in our economy that don't benefit from those types of tax cuts. So it's a very big deal. They did so much of it that in fact it's forecasted they're going to take in so much new revenue that we're now going to be giving some money back distributed under Tabor to all taxpayers, which seems odd to some considering the voters in the last election cut income tax and said to the legislature, we don't want you to create a lot of mechanisms outside of Tabor in our Constitution to fund government services. So watching how that is implemented and how that's described to the voters will be interesting for sure.
So just really quickly, I don't know that a lot of, especially if they're outside of Colorado, but not a lot of our listeners may understand how that works with the Tabor refunds. Like, how does that, can you break that down for us a little bit?
State government, unlike most local governments in Colorado since 1992, can only take in a certain amount of new dollars every year, so a growth factor of around 6%. And that's to try and limit the size of growth. And that was a citizen initiative from 20 some years ago. And that has made it difficult to keep up on roads, on healthcare, on the expense of things like corrections, keeping higher ed affordable for Colorado kids, that type of thing. Some would argue, and some would say, look, I just want to control the size of government, and that's why we did it. So we're going to have to see how all of this works over the next several months and how the legislature will prioritize spending moving forward. Part of that conversation, just so you're aware, the legislature created a few bills at the end of session that takes this next bunch of federal funds, let's call it about $3.8 billion that we're going to get as part of COVID. They spent about, give or take about $1 billion, let's say. They created a bank account for affordable housing, for example, about $550 million, and some other different pots of money. And then this, starting in the late summer and into fall, they're going to have interim committees that Action 22 and your listeners will want to watch and participate in on how they want to see that next tranche of federal funds spent between now and I believe the last batches can be spent by 2026.
So the state took the dollars and they put them into bank accounts. How does, and who from housing can withdraw? How do they withdraw that money? Is that going to work? Or do they even know yet?
They don't know yet. The legislature is going to have what they'll call interim committees or committees this summer where they'll take testimony from groups like Action 22 and and all of your, the folks that are listening, and they'll take recommendations on how to spend that, and then they'll run legislation in the next session in 2022 on how to obligate and spend those dollars. And let me say, it's historic. I've never seen this kind of money in the state budget. You can really talk about transformation. You can really be very, as much as the federal government dollars will allow us to use them for different purposes, you can really make a big difference in how Colorado looks and lives in the years ahead.
So that leads us, before we go to break, to that was a great segue to what we're doing tomorrow, and it's this stop to collaborate and listen about exactly that. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to utilize the state for some of these projects? I was up at CCI this weekend, and Huerfano County is getting 1.3 million. Huerfano County, this tiny, poor little county, is getting 1.3 million. They are definitely going to have to go back to the table to get all the projects and everything that they need done down there on infrastructure and everything else, and really do. We're going to have to really help them and do a good job on that. So that's tomorrow. It's going to be, it'll be Facebook Live if you want to stop and listen to it. We have a lot of people coming in, and mayors and county commissioners and citizens, and we're just going to start these conversations then. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the bigger lifts were, some things that we, as an organization, with your help, we're going to put in the win column, if we could call it that, but also some of the bigger fights that happened, or the bigger struggles that happened this session. So stick with us. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back, everybody. So, Mike, there was the public option. This has been years and years and years in the making. Give us a brief update on what happened with the public option.
Well, the public option is something that is being talked about around the country. Washington State is the first one, and for those who are listening and watching, that's a government-backed health plan, insurance plan. And, Colorado tried to model what Washington State did, but they couldn't quite get agreement, not just among Republicans and Democrats, but even among Democrats. And so, they are starting on January 1st of 2022, the Commissioner of Insurance will establish by rule the Standardized Health Insurance Plan that our private health providers will be required to offer to the individual and small group market. And so I think for folks in rural Colorado, that's a significant, and small businesses, that's a significant step into the market by government. It's not, again, not quite what they did in Washington State. One of the things that both parties agreed that is that this really needs to be done through a very public stakeholder process. It can't just be done by a handful of folks in the Division of Insurance in Denver. And so the bill is very specific about that. And that if you're buying your health plan now off the exchange, the Colorado Health Benefit Exchange, they really want to model whatever is offered to the public off of those types of plans. So it's just, the goal was to inject a little bit more competition. What was controversial is that it requires, it allows the commissioner to, set rates for those plans, and the network adequacy and all of those things. The commissioner is a big, more so than if you were his own insurance company. And so not only what hospitals get reimbursed, but medical providers get reimbursed. And if they don't participate, this bill fines them for not doing it. So that isn't necessarily a market signal, that is, so that's unique. And so we're going to have to see how that works. And we'll see how that's implemented over the next 2-3 years.
Will they be able to make any decisions on how they participate? Like in what way and what aspects of it they would participate? Or is it just all or nothing?
It's my view, it's all or nothing. Now, That's the way it's written today, but in defense of the proponents of this bill, there will be a lot of rulemaking. So the commissioner will take this bill, Commissioner of Insurance, and he and his staff will refine these things and take comments and work on how to implement that with that through that stakeholdering process that's so intensive throughout this new statute. So very, very big policy shift. And we'll have to see how it's implemented. If they do it right, it'll be a model for the rest of the country, similar to the way Washington State has modeled their approach.
So with this going forward, do you predict that it will drive the cost of insurance down in some of these communities? I know some of the poorest communities and also the resort towns, which have citizens of Colorado that live there, and they're not necessarily the rich, affluent property owners in like Aspen. Will this drive the cost of healthcare down for them, or will it impact that at all?
The goal, that's exactly the goal, right? That if this plan is injected into the market with lower rates, that the rest of the market will respond to try and meet that. I know that's a stated goal, and I think it's a good one. We just have to see how it works and how it's implemented. And I would say the opponents of this bill, and I didn't work on this particular bill in my line of work, I would just say they would say that those goals will be impossible to achieve. So both sides agreed to disagree and created a statute that forces the conversation, in my opinion, to continue. And that's probably a good thing.
Let's talk about passenger rail.
So, there's there was a bill that created an authority in statute similar to the Regional Transportation District up in the Denver metro area for the development of a train and connect many parts of the Front Range together by a train system. Why all of a sudden, after talking about it for years, did that pop up in a bill form? It's my view that our new president talked about in his infrastructure bill, billions of dollars for states that have these types of mechanisms in place that, that they could partner with local governments, state governments to help develop this vision. And again, as I talked about earlier on the transportation bill, many people believe that you can't, in this case, have I-25 is going to be able to carry all of the traffic and all of the growth that we're going to see over the next several decades. So maybe a train would help along the Front Range, similar to places like California is currently developing. So this bill allows those local communities until 2024 to put something on the ballot to see if folks all the way from Adams County to Pueblo County and everything in between, if they can figure out a way to develop a plan, identify where a train would go, all the infrastructure that supports that type of multimodal transportation, and ask the voters if they're willing to tax themselves. I believe that if the infrastructure bill the president talks about is passed, and you can see in today's news, those conversations have largely fallen away from a bipartisan solution there in DC into more of one that Democrats will need to shoulder on their own. Whether or not, if the federal government does get it together and does pass those dollars to the state, you almost can guarantee between now and 2024 a ballot measure to add state dollars, local tax dollars to that mix.
I think our concern on that was, it's a tough one because the way the proposal is drawn up, it would benefit some of our eastern plains, like Otero County would definitely benefit. Pueblo County would benefit, and then it would go north. But we still have our good friends down by Trinidad, Los Animas, and even into New Mexico, Raton, that wasn't a part of this proposal. Was there any explanation that you saw or any rationale that you saw as to why that wasn't the case?
I think they're looking at where infrastructure the proponents were looking, where does rail infrastructure exist now and that those can be redeveloped and reimagined in a way that meets this broader goal. Nothing precludes a change in this statute in the next year to add other counties to that taxing mix, or
That
even
was going to be my next question.
either take communities out. El Paso County commissioners voted to oppose this bill because they didn't believe there was enough stakeholdering and enough planning into it. And other communities in places like Aurora loved it. And so it underscores the point that there's a lot more conversation that needs to be done. And Colorado probably should. It's probably good policy to get Colorado's act together in case the feds get their act together and start sending federal dollars to us. Now, I wouldn't advise anyone, especially if they're driving and listening to us at the same time, don't hold your breath that all of that's going to make good sense to start thinking and planning.
Agreed.
And just so you know, it's twofold for Pueblo because a lot of the rail that will be manufactured is out of Evraz here in Pueblo.
Oh, I see.
So with this project going forward, that impacts Pueblo because Evraz kind of has this up and down employment. It's every 2 years laid off, hiring,
Right.
rehiring. This would solidify a great contract for Evraz and ensure that there would be employees there and hiring people to build this rail for this specific project.
No, that would be tremendous. And I'm sort of half cheering because, if it does happen and we can see that, but I definitely would like to see our Los Animas County and those south benefit from this. So I have to say for probably the last 2 months, I've been in more communication with you than I have my own mom, Mike. And the two big things that we have been trying to keep the conversation or to get something reasonable out of were, of course, ag and energy. So let's first talk about ag and how that all went, and then let's talk about energy.
Well, I think agriculture on the plus side, I think they would tell you that those communities would tell you they're grateful for the legislature's support in a bipartisan fashion of the delivery of federal COVID relief dollars, not just to their local governments, but to their, the opportunities for rural businesses. We know that there are these federal and state dollars are being made available to store more of Colorado's water, that type of thing. And I know that that's a benefit. That conversation was somewhat overshadowed by a conversation about, legislation that provided agricultural workers more employment protection, and ended up being one of the fiercest emotional discussions that I've seen in many years in the legislature. It gives agricultural workers the right to organize and join labor unions through engaging in collective bargaining, and also the right to strike. There was a conversation, and a lot of legislators, that aren't familiar with the agricultural operations in both parties didn't know that sometimes in the ag operations, meal breaks and rest periods weren't set in stone, that they had to go with the conditions that the workers were working in, that their salaries weren't necessarily similar to those that might work in a retail establishment in any part of our state. And the bill requires wages to be set and adjusted annually for cost of living, and that overtime be paid as well. And that was very controversial for a lot of different reasons. And what I saw, the bill that I just described to you in a very generic sense, was one that both sides of that bill seemed very unhappy. And they did compromise, right? The bill I just described to you was a compromise by both sides, even though Republican legislators, were really very strong and loud about their concerns its effect on have a rural economy. And the proponents of the bill felt like they had given too much, that they had carved out too many different types of employee groups. that would not have now state protection in our state law. And so this is another one that created an advisory committee at the state level to advise the governor and others on how to implement it. It'll be really important for members of Action 22 and your listeners and viewers to be very active in terms of how that turns out and how that's implemented.
And that's going to be another summer interim committee, correct?
That's one that'll go on for longer than this summer, because obviously this will take time to implement and to see what the experience and how it works. Rural Colorado is concerned. I mean, they're concerned about the effects of bills like this, understandably so, and they're worried about how the threat of an initiative might scare off the organizers of the National Western Stock Show, that our stock show may leave Colorado so they don't have to worry about the threat of citizen initiative that is really anti-rural Colorado, anti-agriculture, I'll call our livestock community. So it's very important that we pay attention to these things.
Okay, let's talk about the other big one that there was lots and lots of fists throwing and that's energy.
So I would argue that I would suggest that the conversation, the governor was very clear that he didn't want one board, non-elected in Colorado, having control of whole sectors of our economy related to emissions, and that they could be ordered to do things that would affect, the economy in broad terms.
Right.
Ultimately compromised on that bill and gave broad authority. Many of your listeners are going to, if they're not familiar with, they will in the years ahead, the Air Quality Control Commission, because to be able to set goals that exceed, in my opinion, what's in, emission reduction goals. And it's not just about, like Black Hills or Xcel Energy. It's in the manufacturing sector that will affect everything from the Suncor refinery in Commerce City to the steel mill in Pueblo, for example, ag operations, anywhere there's manufacturing, they're going to really want to pay attention to how this bill is implemented. And if that commission exceeds those state goals, that they really are engaged to make sure that they can mitigate the impact of the economy.
So here's my big concern. Well, and it's a concern that we voiced all along. And we actually had agreed with the governor about, and it was Senate Bill 200. We testified against it a couple of times. And our big concern is we do not like governance by rulemaking, and especially with this commission. So the thing that's ironic about this is the governor appoints the Air Quality Control Commission, and even he had a problem with the Air Quality Control Commission having these broad sweeping powers. And so they basically moved that over to, if I'm remembering this right, they moved a lot of those provisions over from the Senate bill to a House bill 1266. Is that right?
I would say not provisions. I would say concepts.
Okay.
Very different, into a different bill, House Bill 1266, that didn't have a hearing. So there wasn't really any public testimony on a 25-page amendment. Now, having said that, the process at the AQCC is a very public one. The Action 22, the State Chamber of Commerce, and everyone in between was engaged once that language was introduced this last Monday. It's hard to believe it was just introduced on Monday and it's already passed.
Yeah.
And it will affect our economy and planning certainty for businesses and governmental entities for generations, whether, in terms of how it's implemented. So I think every Coloradan is an environmentalist, right? I really do.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. And so I think that box is checked. Now the conversation is, well, how do you want to do better? And on top of all the other things that we've done in the past. And I think the proponents of this bill get that there are goals to reduce emissions and to clean our air in Colorado, but they want more certainty that it's actually happening, and that it's not just people on their electric utility or their gas utility, but it's in whole segments of our economy. Again, for example, manufacturing, agriculture, et cetera. So this is a big bill. One of the biggest ones that I've seen in many years in this space, and it's going to take a lot of attention by folks like us to make sure it's implemented properly.
I kind of feel like we're going to have an Action 22 committee just that will watchdog the Air Quality Control Commission. And I think it's something that I'm going to have a conversation with our board about tomorrow, because as we saw in the middle of all this, we were looking into the transportation funding bill, and we tripped across, and it was completely unrelated, but we tripped across a bill that had been proposed by the commission that would charge people, in effect, charge people to go to work, or charge companies to send their employees to work.
Not a bill.
No,
A
it
rule.
wasn't a bill. Sorry, you're right. It was a rule. It was a rule, and it was a preview of things to come. And now that this is passed, and again, the 25-page amendment that never got any kind of hearing, I feel like that should be very alarming to all the Coloradans that just happened.
Well, look, I've been involved in bigger bills in terms of pages at the last minute, combining bills. It's not uncommon to combine things at the end of session that have died or stalled in other places. So that's how we make sausage, for those of you familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
And it is as gross as it sounds. Now the hard work of monitoring it and being engaged. I mean, the proponents of this bill are always going to show up, because they're in it for their reasons that they care deeply about. And those who want to continue to live and work in a good economy and to make sure this is implemented fairly, are going to have to show up now as it's implemented. And when they don't like what they see, they're going to have to go to court, or they're going to have to go back to the legislature and the governor and seek relief.
We just made a whole lot more work for ourselves, is what we did with that.
Well, as a lobbyist, I would say that's job security, right?
I'm so
you're
tired
right
now.
You know what? This is the best state in the country to live in. And it's taken a long time to get where we're at, and we can figure this out.
Right. Can we talk about 1324?
1324 is a bill that it very much related to energy and kind of the energy evolution away from fossil fuels. And this was a bill that more specifically will allow Xcel Energy some certainty from the Public Utilities Commission to do up to 300 megawatts in areas where it's anticipated more fuel switching will go on. And so what do I mean by that? Where coal plants will shut down, natural gas plants will convert into some other technology. So in Northeast Colorado, in Northwest Colorado, and in places like Pueblo, it's signaled to the Public Utilities Commission, look, let them go out and experiment with caps to ratepayers, and with some discretion, common sense discretion to the Public Utilities Commission to use experimental utility scale technology to see what is the next step of beyond wind and solar. Wind and solar will not be enough to get to a zero carbon economy. So what technologies can be used with those consumer safeguards to get to that next mile, or that last 20% to get to 100% clean energy, and stabilize local property tax base and to help preserve jobs in those economies now. That's what this bill does, and it signals to the PUC that it's important to do that. Action 22 and the voices in Southern Colorado were very important in the legislature. Senator Simpson and others who were instrumental in making sure that with those safeguards in place, we should go ahead and start looking at what does energy look like moving on past fossil fuels in a responsible way, instead of oh yeah, we're going to shut that plant down in a year. We better start thinking about it. Those
Correct.
stations for 2030 start today with the passage of that bill. Couldn't be more proud of that bill. It's something that I worked on behalf of Xcel Energy and all of you. And it's a really important bill for these rural communities, and it wouldn't have been possible without Action 22.
Well, thanks. That was one of the things that I think we can put in the win column. And I don't know that there was a lot of settling. There's a lot in the settlement, settling for it column. And then there was this one that was a win. And I was really proud that we were actually able to get that done. So what, for those of us who are routinely in the arena, what is the summer going to look like for everybody?
No, I think the legislature is going to go back to normal. So starting in around July or end of July, 1st of August, we're going to start talking again about how do we want to finance schools? How do we want to spend these federal stimulus dollars? How do we want to look at transportation, higher ed, those kind of things? All of those conversations will continue on. 2024 is an election year. It's a big one. All of the governor and one down will be on the ballot. You're going to be talking about redistricting later on, but every legislator is going to be running in a new district. And so I'm not sure as much will get done by the legislature in 2024, because I think they'll have to not only keep an eye in both political parties on policy conversations in the legislature, but they'll also have an eye on the new people that they'll represent, new districts that they're going to want to ask them to return them to the legislature. And we do that every 10 years. And I think that will dominate a lot of what we do starting now.
I agree with you. And with that, and you can stick around and weigh in with your thoughts on this, but we do want to talk a little bit about redistricting. So this is something the Action 22 Board of Directors, we've been working on this, and we started this conversation. I'm going to say we even went back and came out in support of the amendment in 18 or whatever year that was. But this was a really important, we knew this was going to be important on the redistricting, and we wanted to have at least our objectives as an organization in place. And so we started having this conversation back in October at our annual meeting, and we've been carrying it through every single meeting that we've had since then. The whole idea is that what matters most to those we serve is that they are adequately represented. That's the most important thing to them. And it's a thing that was heavy on their mind. And it was heavy on our mind, is how we get that, make sure that happens. Especially when you're talking about the incredibly strong urban base that we see up north. So our proposal was that if there was going to be a redistricting, that it was 7, and now we know for sure that it's 8, that at least 2 of those districts should be purely rural districts. And then the urban areas can figure out what needs to happen with those other 6 districts, but it needs to be 2 very strong rural ones. So we got together with Club 20 and Pro 15. We put our heads together, and there's a map that everybody has seen. The Denver Post ran that map last week, and it simply is, there's 4 objectives, and because the whole idea of redistricting is not to allow gerrymandering to continue or to get rid of that practice. The response initially was sort of okay and a little bit of confusion, because we got our map to the commission and had the conversation with the commission very early on. We felt like those went really, really well. But something interesting happened yesterday, and Brian, you testified to the commission yesterday.
Yes,
so
I
talk
did.
a little bit about that, because I don't know how many people heard that.
So you had already done it once, and I was talking to the same people that you talked to. And the way I ran it was like, hey, look, here's our map. This is what Action 22 is. You've seen what we endorse along with Pro 15, Club 20. And I just opened it up to questions. That was it. And, one question that came up that is interesting when it comes to the map that we endorse was, well, how would you feel about Douglas County being lumped in with Pueblo County, because right now the 4th Congressional District has Douglas County in it. And, I straight up said, like, as it stands now, and I know the maps can't be based off of current congressional districts, but in the current dynamic of things, the population is Weld County and Douglas County. So the representative, for better or worse, does not need to come down to southeastern Colorado. You have to focus on the constituents that you represent, and that is going to be Douglas County and Weld County. And I said, well, if you include Douglas County, and in our proposed map, Pueblo County is going to be on that side, the 4th district, or whatever district they call it. And it's included with Weld County. So with that, it kind of balances it out. It's like a yin yang,
Right.
It's like you have a huge population center up here and another one down here, and then everything in between. And that would require, for proper representation, to go from Weld County to Pueblo County and everything around. When they asked how I felt about Douglas County being included in it, I'm like, well, that would dilute Pueblo. I mean, southern Colorado right there, because then you would still have 2/3 of the population up north and, the rest down here. The other issue, and if you read my quote in the paper about it, one issue that was brought up, and I even said I don't like this and I don't agree with this, but you have a Western Slope district and an Eastern Plains district. And Eastern Plains is weird. I think it's kind of a misnomer, because Eastern Plains includes like the San Luis Valley,
Right.
Pueblo. It's basically everything over the mountains.
The divide, yeah.
On the right side. You look at Colorado, it's the right side of the mountains. And the map that we endorse, it does put Alamosa and everything west of that into the Western Slope district. And one concern was, well, you're splitting up these communities of interest, specifically the Latino community in this area, because you have ties from Pueblo to Alamosa to Trinidad. And my response is, no, it's not perfect, but it's based off of population. And as it currently stands, you have Pueblo in one district and Trinidad in a different district. And I didn't say this, but I should have. And it's kind of like, we're not talking about building a border where it's going to cut off Alamosa from Huerfano County. This is the best of all the options based on population. And it's, in my opinion, the map as it stands that we endorsed is better than the map we have now.
I agree with you on that. So here's what was interesting that happened yesterday, as that was going on, is that the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce proposed a map, and so this is the map that they proposed. I'm going to get into the problems I have with that map in just a second.
In 4 minutes.
But let me just say that, Action 22, Club 20, Pro 15, we got together there. We're not getting any funds or any money to push this map. It's because it's the right thing to do. And it averts gerrymandering, and it follows the exact letter of the law. This was clearly a very well-funded, very broad campaign for this map. And here's my problem with it. And there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
They had a video with it. They had all of this stuff.
That's fine.
And that's fine, except for, here's the thing. The idea that you would put a Douglas County in the same congressional district, and by the way, Douglas County is the 7th wealthiest county in the United States, that you're going to put them in the same congressional district as Los Animas County or Pueblo County or any of our Eastern Plain counties.
Which Douglas County is in the same district as Los Animas County right now.
Right now,
and we're seeing how that's going.
And we see how that's going. And expect that they're going to get the same representation as Los Animas County would get the same representation as the population in Douglas County.
Yeah,
that's my problem.
And it's just a proposed map. The thing that people have to understand is that these are just ideas that these groups are putting together. And the commission is going to release a map, I believe, June 24th. And that's when you really got to put the work into it. We have to see what they're thinking after all this input and what they come out with, whether we're going to fight it or we're going to support it.
Right.
Or, be neutral in it too. The biggest takeaway from the meeting yesterday for me was that we look at our map and all the maps, and it's El Paso County is going to be its own district. But El Paso County might be too big to be its own district. And so the question of the day yesterday is like, if you had to split El Paso County, how do you split that? Do you put the western side of El Paso County with the western slope? Do you put the eastern side with the eastern plains? Do you put the northern Lake Monument area in with a Denver district? Or do you put, and this actually was not brought up in it. And if they would have asked me this question, if like you had to split El Paso County, how would you do it? And I would say that, you know, Fountain security area would be great to go with Pueblo County if you had to split it. And the reason for that is the big thing is the military. 1/3 of Fort Carson is in Pueblo County, and the majority of the people that work there, a big chunk, live in Fountain and Pueblo County.
Yeah.
And that would have been my solution. It's like, you can split it at Fountain and put that in Pueblo. But
So we're out of time. We're out of time. But Mike, will you stick around? And because I'd love to hear what you have to say on this, and then that this will go to YouTube. So join us. Oh, sorry, Chad Vorthman. I know that you're listening, but that's okay because I'm going to see you tomorrow at the board meeting. So I will harass you then. Join us next week when we learn a little bit more about Brian's plans for a whiskey distillery here in Pueblo. We're all very excited to hear about that. And I'm going to ask a lot of overly complicated questions. Join us next week. We'll see you then. And we can edit some of this out. But thoughts that you had on this redistricting concept, especially of the 2 rural districts, do you think that is that big of an ask?
You know, I think what we're doing is plowing new soil here. We don't know. We've never had a commission like this that is truly just folks, you know, randomly volunteered and were selected. We don't have, in my mind, clear legal definition of what some of these, community of interest means, for example. And it is going to be a challenge. And you guys spent time talking about some of the intensity and the thought behind congressional districts. I think there will likely to be carnage in the state legislative districts because they look at a blank map. They don't look at where current legislators live. They very well could be drawn together, especially in the state house. And so it's going to be a real, even though you're going to get preliminary maps with preliminary data to draw those maps at the end of this month, state and federal, my concern is this will be litigated well into the spring, and that's going to delay the election calendar for next year, which might be something we're dealing with in January or February. So I think this is a good example, and I've said it a million times on your program here today. People need to show up and they need to participate because this is a blank slate and precedent setting everything that's going on. So when we look back 20, 30 years from now, the conversations happening right now are critical.
So, and I think that's one of the interesting things because there was a bill there was a bill that was introduced, I think, and I might be getting this slightly wrong, so correct me. There was a bill that was introduced that the legislature wanted to see, for that exact reason, wanted to see the calendar changed, and the courts threw that out. Am I remembering that right?
I would describe it that the legislature asked the Supreme Court, in my simple view, can we kind of direct the commission? Can we urge them to do certain things within certain parameters, give them time to do what they need, use preliminary data, that type of, lots of different questions related to the function of the commission. And the Supreme Court came back and said the commissions for state and federal redrawing can use preliminary data, but beyond that, they're free of the legislature and you can't tell them what to do. And so which was
the whole idea, right? But they can't tell them what to do. So that was the original idea.
It was, but they were seeking some clarity, right? Both parties in the legislature were saying, yeah, but can we?
It's always worth asking.
It doesn't hurt to ask. And the Supreme Court said, no, they're independent. And even though there are hard dates in the Constitution through the initiative that set that up, are they going to be able to meet those dates because of the lateness in getting census data from the federal government? That's a real question in my mind, and how that will work. And then there's always litigation at the tail end of these things, especially over the last 30 years. And so will they be done in time to, have June primary, to have caucus in March, and for the political parties to plan, for your county clerk to redraw their precincts, that type of thing in a timely fashion. All of those things all relate together. It's a domino effect.
Yeah. I
So-
sometimes forget about that part with the drawing the precincts, because there's a whole slew of rules just around that, and
Right.
and where you can on county borders, or even city lines, and that's it takes a lot of time to do that. And I think you're right. I think there's going to be, people are going to throw fists on that one too. And you almost don't blame them, but I wasn't around. It was the perfect storm because of COVID, and of course I wasn't around 10 years ago when all this was going on. If you take the COVID piece out of it, is it a little less contentious or a little less hot, or is it the same thing?
Anytime you're creating new law without, any clarity given by a court case, especially in this space, it's going to be intense. And this is important. This is how we set up our legislature and how we influence a close U.S. Congress. And this is one of the most important things that Colorado faces over the next 10, 12 months.
Yeah.
We're going to be working on it, and we've been working on the congressional side of it, and we're just starting to have the conversations about what's important, what matters most on the legislative side. We've really adhered very closely to this idea of not gerrymandering and not taking into consideration, because that's the fourth directive, not taking into consideration any incumbent or any person that's running for office, or basically the will or agenda of either political party.
Mm.
And that is not an easy thing to do, because it's a complete, like you said, we're plowing here. It's a complete new concept to look at these maps and not be thinking through a gerrymandering filter. That's been the interesting thing to me. And again, I wasn't around 10 years ago. So that piece makes sense to me, where we're not gerrymandering. It's got to be this.
The interesting thing, though, is anything can be defined as gerrymandering. Like if we're looking out for Action 22 membership, that means you're gerrymandering for Action 22. So gerrymandering is such a broad, it's like this weird concept that's not well defined. And I know that in the terms that they use gerrymandering, it's for political party. It's
Right.
like no gerrymandering for political party. But that's impossible. Like looking at how they're going to break these maps up, and competitiveness, non-gerrymandering. But if you draw 5 districts around Denver, could you consider that gerrymandering, because they are going to be Democrat?
Right.
And if you draw rural districts, and we heard it in a few Action 22 meetings, they're like, well, you're talking about rural Colorado. When I hear rural, I hear Republican.
Yeah.
And like
yeah.
any lens, you could look at it and claim anything that anybody puts out as gerrymandering with this. Even communities of interest. So like, again, going back to rural, we heard again, it's like, well, communities of interest, rural communities, that's Republican communities.
So, it's really interesting for our rural communities, now that you say that, if you were to sit with just about anybody in our rural communities and say, okay, tell me a little bit about yourself. Their political party might be 6th or 7th or 8th on their list of things that they use to identify themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to me that anybody would say, oh, well, we can't do we heard some pushback on El Paso County. El Paso County has the numbers. They are community. I mean, they fit the bill all the way down.
Well, but again, El Paso County, that's going to be interesting, because I don't think El Paso County is going to be its own district. They have too many people. So the challenge is to see where that's going to split.
Yeah.
And that's, again, that was a conversation of yesterday. It's like, how would you split El Paso County? And Wayne Williams was on, and he is,
Oh, yeah.
I thought I'd have the biggest beard on the meeting, but Wayne Williams had, he had
I
the biggest
saw
beard and
him.
mustache.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa.
Yes.
But
And we love Wayne Williams. He's so great. So we're going to see what happens with all of this, and we want your input. If you're listening to this, if you stuck with us, it's really important that, I mean, we'd love to hear your input, but it's also really, really important. This commission is giving heavy weight to public comment.
yeah,
If you get my emails, the Action 22 emails, the one that came out this morning has a link for you to go and make public comment. If you don't get those emails and you're a listener, you can go and make public comment by visiting the Independent Redistricting website. So just Google Colorado Independent Redistricting, and there's several things, but you can go to it. So I just sent the link that goes straight to public. But it would be interesting for people to go and look at the website so that they understand the process a little bit more, because they're going to do something like they're going to do a listening tour around the state, and they're doing 30 something convenings, or they're doing 30 something meetings where
public hearings.
those public hearings where you can go and do that. So if you have thoughts on this, go and make your voice heard. That's the mission of Action 22, but this is what we're talking about. We've got to strengthen that voice, and if we sit on the sidelines, then we deserve what we get, especially on this issue.
Yep. And in closing, Mike, give us some good news. Tell us something good.
Tell us something great, Mike.
You know, my favorite quote from Winston Churchill is, he would say about America, you can always count on them to do the right thing, but after they've done everything else first. I think the same can be said about
great.
Colorado, and these are hard things that we've talked about. It's a strong a lot of strong-willed folks on both sides of the issues, but at the end of the day, I believe and have optimism that we will get through these things. We will make education, transportation, healthcare, all those things that we talked about today better. And I think hopefully we've said repeatedly to folks, you should show up, you should make your voice heard, because, other people are going to do it if you don't, and they may not have your interests at heart. So I think Action 22 plays a very critical role in what in public policy in Colorado, and without it, I don't know where we would be, especially the great communities that you represent. So,
well, thank you so much, Mike.
For you, and I appreciate being invited on today.
We appreciate you so much,
And
Mike.
one last thing, I got to tell an interesting story that you will appreciate, Mike. My wife, her parents are selling their house, and it's an old Victorian home here in Pueblo, kind of towards the mill area, built in the late 1800s. And she went in because my wife's a realtor, and she's getting everything in order for it. And my mother-in-law has the original title to the house, which is on cloth.
That's crazy.
And signed on the original title is Goodnight and Thatcher.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's crazy. See, good Colorado history.
Yep. And there's only been 5 owners of the house over 100+ years. And it used to be but prior to her mom buying it, it was the Pueblo Symphony House. And then it had something to do with the church for 70 years. It's where the symphony director would live, and their office was there. And then they had nuns in there. But yeah, Thatcher and Goodnight are on the original cloth title that they have with the house still, which I thought is a history buff. That's really cool.
That really is cool. Well, thank you again, and good to see
you.
you all, and all the folks that have been listening and texting me. They all owe me lunch. It's good to be out and about again.
Well, thanks, Mike. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Stop.